Good morning. I would like to call to order the Board of Administration for SDCERS January 2020 board meeting. Cynthia, do we have a quorum?
Yes, we have a quorum.
We've got everybody. All our shining faces are here. Do we have non-agenda public comment? I believe we have Dick Wilkin. And welcome to our friend Dick. And three. Oh, Joe? Oh, hey, Joe.
Oh, awesome.
Thank you very much. For the old board members that I served with, I want to say it's great to see you all again. And for those, a bunch of new board members, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Dick Wilkin. I served as the elected trustee, retiree trustee on the board for 6 years. Charlie followed me, and so I want to introduce myself. I'm the incoming president of the City of San Diego Retired Employees Association, so I'm just beginning a term there, so I'm continuing to be involved. I'd like to acknowledge the passing of Dave Hall, who is a trustee. He preceded me on the board, and Dave is someone that had a distinguished law enforcement career. And in relationship to his work and support of retirees, he served, again, as a trustee. He served as the president of the Retired Fire and Police Association. And since I've been involved in the REA, we call it for short, Retirees Association, we work really cooperatively together. Dave was a great person to work with, very supportive of retiree issues. And we're sorry to see him pass in December. He will be greatly missed. I'd like also a couple of other issues. I'd like to thank the new board members and the old board members. Since I've served for 6 years, I know what a commitment it is in terms of effort and time, energy, and on behalf of the board of the Retirees Association and all of the retirees, I want to thank you for your efforts. And finally, I'd like to pass along some kudos. I've been involved all the way back to the days that were not so pleasant with the Aguirre lawsuits and so forth, and this board and so forth, and we're trying to work with staff at that time and with the management, and things were kind of rocky in terms of issues and working relationships and so forth. Starting with Greg's predecessor, Mark Hovey, things started turning around and developed into great working relationships. With Greg's assumption and Marcel's assumption and Cynthia Queen's addition to staff, things have been going in recent years very, very smoothly. Staff understands that retirees really are why you're here, and they're very responsive. They're cooperative. We twice a year, 2 or 3 times a year, have what's called a Retirees Issues Task Force, where we meet and discuss issues, both us and the Retired Fire and Police and the Retiree Association. We have Cynthia chairs the meetings. We have a list of agenda items. People on both sides agree to do certain things and hold each other accountable, and they do get things done, and we have a great working relationship. So I want the board to know that we really appreciate it, really appreciate the job that Greg and Marcel and Cynthia and the other staff are doing. And you, as the board, I want you to know how appreciative we are of that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those kind comments. Thank you for honoring David Hall, and thank you for your continuing involvement with the Retirees Association. And
Thank you, Carol.
Good to see you. Okay, next we have another speaker, Joe Flynn.
Thank you, President Broad and members of the board. My name is Joe Flynn. I was served as a elected retiree representative on the board. I preceded Dave Hall, so you have almost the full lineage here today, with the exception of Dave. Wanted to comment on Dave Hall's passing. We've all lost a good friend and a multi-talented individual who gave unsparingly of his time and talent. And this is especially true of his time as trustee at SDCERS. Whatever the question or task, Dave could be counted on to find a way through. My father had referred to those he held in highest esteem actually, as a prince of a fellow. So Dave Hall was truly a prince of a fellow, and we will miss him dearly. As we start the new year, Dick Wilkin talked about the earlier times on the board, and I had the privilege of serving on the board during those difficult times. We found our way through under the direction, leadership of Peter Priovalos, Tanasi's father, who is still one of my heroes for leading us out of the big thicket. But did want to thank all of the trustees elected and appointed who volunteer their time and talent for SDCERS. You are greatly appreciated. And our award-winning staff keeps on winning awards. SDCERS has always been ahead of the curve and continues to lead the way. Speaking of leading the way, I couldn't help but smiling over a recent headline that said that a number of corporations in California were scrambling to find and place women on their boards. SDCERS has always had women on the board, and now we have President Carol Broad and Vice President Karina Coleman elected by their colleagues. So SDCERS could give lessons. Again, I want to thank you very much for your time and effort. It is much appreciated. I know that it is difficult for a lot of the retirees to come down here and participate, but we do have the option of the live streaming and the videos so that they are carefully paying attention to all of your efforts, and it is always very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for those supportive words, and we certainly share your feeling about our staff, our wonderful staff, and appreciate you honoring your colleague, David Hall, and our colleague. So thanks very much. Okay, no further public comment. We will move to the consent agenda items. We're pulling item D, and we'll come back to that separately. So we'll be voting on service retirements, drop entries, and drop retirements. So who moves that? Okay, there you go.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that passes 13-0. So next, we'll move to training, item D, and I believe Johnny has some comments on that.
Thank you, Carol. In addition to the written requests in your material, Mr. Shearson would like to attend 3 conferences, which are listed above in the motion, but they are the PIMCO conference in June, the Pension Bridge ESG conference in February, and the Pension Bridge annual conference in April. With that, I would need a motion in a second.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that passes 13-0. Okay, next we're moving into business operations, and we welcome our actuaries, Gene Kowarski and his colleague Alice, to talk about the June 30th, 2019 valuation.
Good morning.
Good morning, welcome.
Don't worry about it. Everybody knows. So, every January for the past, probably past decade or so, we come here in January and present the results of the annual checkup of the system, where we collect all the valuation data as of June 30th and produce the valuation results, and then the board has until the March meeting when we come back to approve it. So today is more informational and not to look for any action by the board. We're going to start with some background, some developments in the prior years, but then we'll dig into the historical trends and then hone in on the valuation results. There's a new actuarial standard of practice. That's what ASOP stands for, number 51. It really has no impact on you, but it does on a number of other systems. We'll talk about that. And then we'll end it with our projections. So we've always shown the pension tank, which is something that came from the Harvard Business Review in 1965 and still is relevant. It depicts a pension fund. The tank itself are the liabilities. The green part are the assets, the water in the tank. And then you've got the expenses going out, where the San Diego Municipal Code governs the benefit provisions, and you folks control the expenses, or staff does. And investment earnings are a function of how many assets you have. But the valuation process each year measures the tank and tells you how much to tweak the employer contribution valve going in and possibly the employee contribution valve because of the substantially equal. At this point, I'll turn it to Allison. Alice.
All right, so today we're coming to you with the June 30, 2019 actuarial valuation results. And those results, we're presenting them during fiscal year 2020, but the results of the valuation provide the actuarially determined contribution, or the ADC, for fiscal year 2021. And the plan sponsors pay that ADC on the first day of the following fiscal year, so July 1st, 2020. And as Jean mentioned, we come to you here in January, and then we'll be back again in March to follow up and vote on the results of the valuation. We like to remind the board and have a look at the complexity of the system, knowing that there are the 3 plan sponsors within the SDCERS system. So the city has many tiers of benefit levels, the UPD and the airport authority. This year, in the valuation results, the significant developments, as you may recall in the January board meeting, or some new faces maybe watched the January board meeting, there were 2 new elements of the funding policy that were adopted. So there's the UAL contribution floor for both the city and the port. So what that means is when a portion of the ADC, of the actuarially determined contribution, comes from payment of the UAL, the unfunded actuarial liability. And should that unfunded actuarial liability payment fall below these 2 floor markers, then the funding policy now says that the payment would be at minimum $275.5 million for the city and $13.3 million for the Port Authority. In addition to that change in the funding policy, there was also a reduction in the amortization period for assumption method changes from 30 years to 20 years. That did not play into effect for the results of this 2019 valuation because there were no changes to the assumption changes in funding methods. But with the next year's valuation, knowing that we're performing an experience study this spring, there will be changes in the assumptions and possibly methods. And so rather than amortizing the impact of those changes over 30 years, going forward, they'll be amortized over 20 years. And lastly, for the city valuation, We incorporated the fiscal year 2020 projected salary increases for both the city members and the safety members. Across the board, for general members, fire, and lifeguards, there was a 3.3% increase on pay rather than the assumed 3.05%, so 25% basis point above the expectation, above the assumption. For police members, however, there was a negotiated agreement between the City of San Diego and the Police Officers Association, and for 2020, for fiscal year 2020, the increases for the police members, which are reflected in this valuation, are 7.3% as of July 1st and 5% as of January 1st, 2020. And then those officers with at least 20 years of service have an additional 5% increase in addition to that. So these are kind of three highlights which are different to this valuation than prior years.
So now we'll go over some historical trends, and the first one being the historical assets and liabilities. The blue bars are the liabilities, and the lines are the assets. The smooth assets are the yellow line, and the green line are assets at market value. And you can see when there's a market dip, like in 2009, while market value dropped significantly, the smooth value didn't recognize it all at once, and it held up. And as we stand in 2019, the two values are almost identical. So it looks like the smoothing has done its job. But talking about the funding ratio, prior to the MP1, MP2 era, you had funded ratios that were near, in the high 90s, and then a combination of MP1 and 2 where there were benefit enhancements coupled with underfunding of the actuarial contribution. At the same time, there was the dot-com burst. So everything hit this plan, and it dropped down to 65.8% there in 2004. And you might say that the system hasn't made that much progress, but I think you'll see in some later charts it's made significant progress because it's gone from 65.8 to 71.6%. I'm looking at the ratios at the top, but that's with the discount rate dropping from 8% to 6.5%. And you'll see more on that in some later slides. This chart is showing what's paid by the city, which are the gold bars, and then what's determined in the actual valuation, which is the blue and green and the small pink for administrative expenses. But you could see in 2003, 4, and 5, that was the underpayment during the MP 1 and 2 years. And then in 2006, there was an overpayment. I think it had to do with the tobacco settlement. And since 2011, the city's been paying exactly what the actuarial contribution is. We don't have anything for 2021 because that's upcoming. This is a pattern of the city's gains and losses. If the number is below 0, that means it's a loss. If it's above 0, it's a gain. And you can see how much more volatile investment gains and losses are than liabilities. And to the right, we show the gains and losses as a percent of, for the assets, for the investment gains and losses as a percent of assets, and for the liabilities as a percent of the liabilities. And you can see how much smaller they are. There is a pattern that's been developing. If you look at those blue bars, starting in 2012, I think it is, where there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 8 consecutive years of losses. They weren't that large, but in the last 2 years they have been. We'll talk about that shortly. And given that this year is the year that we perform an experience study, we will be honing in on what's causing that. But I think as we sit here, we think we know what it is, and I'll get into it shortly. A prior board member always asks us, how has the UAL grown since 2008, a market meltdown to today, and it's grown about 1.8 billion. And this is showing the different components that contributed to the UAL growth year by year, but I'm just going to focus on the very far right large bar that combines all the years. And what's really contributed to the UAL growth is 1.4 billion out of the 1.8 is attributable solely to changes in the investment assumption and the demographic assumptions, mainly mortality. And everything else kind of almost offset each other. So I view this not as a loss, but you've strengthened the system, and you have much more conservative assumptions, and that speaks well for the future. Now we'll turn to the other plan sponsors.
All right, so taking a look at similar historical trends for the Unified Port District. The Unified Port District does have a similar pattern here that we saw with the city in terms of their funded ratio over the period of time. In the early years, the port was over 100% funded, followed by the 2003-2004 dips, and then the most notable dip after 2008, where the funded ratio went from 92% to 77.5% because of the market crash. Since then, as Jean mentioned, similar to the city, that discount rate assumption has changed over the years, gradually over a series, from the 8% discount rate assumption to the current 6.5%. And the port is sitting at 75.6% funded ratio as of the 2019 valuation. In terms of the contributions, the port has consistently paid the actuarially determined contribution, and we see the makeup of their contribution by component. Again, there's a normal cost element, which is the green bar, the UAL payment, which is the navy blue, and then the administrative expense component, which is the pink. So those are the three components that go into the actuarially determined contribution. And the gold bar shows what's actually been paid, and the port has been paying as calculated by the ADC. Gains and losses over the period of time will notably show the investment gains and losses fluctuate much more over the period shown compared to the liability gains and losses. You'll see as a percent, those liability gains and losses less than 1% in quite several recent years. And the liability experience is fluctuating between losses and gains, up and down, which is generally what we like to see in terms of the assumptions. The assumptions for the liability assumptions are never going to hit spot on, but it's good to see that those assumptions are reasonable and consistent in that you have some years of gains, some years of losses. And again, with the experience study that's happening this spring, we'll take a look again to see that those assumptions are holding up in terms of valuing the liabilities. For the port, the factors contributing to the changes in the UAL, the most notable when we go all the way to the right and see all years combined is the $67 million increase on the UAL from the economic assumption change. So that's taking that discount rate assumption from 8% to 6.5%. And the toll that had on the UAL. So that's been paid down and through the UAL payments over the years, but that still attributes to the total UAL, where for as of now it stands at $146 million. The airport authority, we always like to look at them and see their model and how they keep themselves at a higher funded ratio than the other plan sponsors. You'll see in 2019, the airport's funded ratio is 90.8%. And they have an internal funding policy in which they make additional contributions to maintain that minimum of the 90% funded. So over the period shown, even with the dip in 2009, even with the changes in economic assumptions, they've consistently made contributions to keep themselves at a higher level there. And we see that here in the contribution graph for the airport authority. Every year where that gold bar is above, and in times significantly above the calculated contribution, it keeps that funded ratio up. And interesting here, take a look at, for example, the fiscal year 2021, the components of the actuarially determined contribution. The airport's contribution is largely due to the normal cost, so the payment for the coming years, the benefits attributable to the coming year, whereas the UAL payment is a much smaller portion of their payment. Similar fluctuations for the investment and liability. The liability experience here, again, fluctuates over the period. We see gains, we see losses in terms of the demographic and economic assumptions. We're seeing the period fluctuate across. In 2019, the airport experienced some losses, but again, the loss on the smaller plan may look more significant in terms of the bar, but it's still, if you look in the table there, 2019 liability loss was just 0.5% of their liability. Moving on to the factors contributing to change in the UAL for the airport. Here we see, very similar to the city, that 18 million, the black 18 million and the purplish gray 12 million. So the economic assumptions, the demographic assumptions, solidifying, changing those assumptions to better reflect the liability experience has caused an increase on the UAL. The airport's UAL is currently at 20 million.
So now we'll move to the June 30th, 2019 valuation results, and starting with the city, comparing last year to this year with the percentage change in the far right. We expect decline in active members because it's a closed plan, but you see this, even though the actives declined by 3.5, total payroll went up by 6.4, and average salary increased by 10.2%. That's going to largely explain something that's at the bottom, which is an ADC, which is the big number the city cares the most about, going from 350 million to 365. I believe we had anticipated last year it would only go to 355, and that's a $10 million increase beyond. We've been spending a lot of time recently looking at what's causing that, and had a meeting this morning with staff to go over that. And we suspect that one of the problem issues are that you've got 11,000 city employees, and the city may be viewing pay increases for the 11,000, but only 6 of them are in this plan. So to the degree those 6,000 got higher increases than the balance may be attributable to that, but that's something we're going to be doing over the next 2 or 3 weeks and providing the city with details on this so that they can perhaps identify where this is coming from. And that's probably the biggest news that came out of this valuation is that jump of an additional 10 million. But the funded ratio in the middle part on a smooth value increased from 70.8 to 71.6 and slightly improved on a market value from 73.2 to 73.4. So this is showing the causes of the increase, and I've already pretty much spoke about that. The number that jumps out of this table is in the middle there, fiscal year ending 2019 liability experience of 166 million. That is where the payroll impact is shown, and again, resulting in the ADC increasing to 365. I don't know if I'm going to move on to have Alice do the Unified Port and Airport, and then we'll get into the wrap-up.
So looking at the snapshot results for the Unified Port District in terms of membership, their active population remained relatively stable at 361 compared to 365. Average salary increased about 4.2%. In terms of the inactives, those that are in pay status, there was a slight uptick in the number of payees, and the average benefit increased by 3.5%. In terms of the actuarial funded ratio, we see the breakdown of the liability here compared to the actual value of assets, taking us to the actuarial value funded ratio of, as we saw in the historical chart, it went up from 74.2% to 75.6%. So an improvement there in that the funded ratio. The ADC, or the actuarially determined contribution, in 2018 was 19.3 million, compared to the current valuation coming in at 19.7 million. Looking at the breakdown, there was not too much unexpected on the port's liability experience. A $4 million liability experience loss translates to about a 0.4 million uptick in the ADC. So where that actually determined contribution was expected to remain level at the 19.3, it is resulting at 19.7 million. The Airport Authority is still a younger plan in terms of plan maturity, and we see that in the growth of the active population and the growth of the payroll. The average salary for the airport membership increased by 2.6%. And the in-pays, there was a pretty big jump in the population that's now receiving benefits, a 10.2% increase, but that's less than 20 heads of new members in pay status, with an average benefit increase of 1.7%. Their actuarial liabilities, assets market value comes into showing that funded ratio on an actuarial value of assets went from 89% to 90.8%. And a large part of that uptick was the additional contributions that the airport made based on their funding policy, their internal funding policy, to at least hit that 90% minimum. Their ADC in the yellow section there of this table, the ADC, so the employer normal cost increased slightly as expected, as it's a level percent of pay. The UAL payment went down because they're paying off their UAL and not a large liability, negative liability or asset experience. So it brings their ADC for the year to 6.1 million. The components of change, again, similar to the port, there was nothing big that jumped out. There was an expected decrease in the ADC asset experience. The asset experience here we see brought down the ADC largely because of the additional contributions that the airport is making to their plan. By making those additional contributions, it's helping paying now reduces the ADC in the future. So their final ADC is 6.125 million.
So I mentioned actuarial standard of practice. A new one came out, it's ASOP 51, and it's ASOP on the assessment disclosure of risk with the number of pension plans, particularly in the Taft-Hartley arena, that are going insolvent, and certain public plans like Illinois, New Jersey, Kentucky having issues. My profession decided to come up with a new practice to require actuaries to disclose more about the risks of a pension fund. This is going to have zero impact on you because we've always been doing the projections and the stress testing, and so that's even beyond what the ASOP requires. I'm disappointed to tell you that the ASOP doesn't even require an actuary to do a projection, even if you suspect the plan's going insolvent. But I don't know how you know it's going insolvent if you didn't project it. But so there won't be any change, but we brought it up here because it's something you may be hearing about, and again, it has zero impact on you because you've more than met the standard. The other thing we'll show you is NASRA's got a database that they maintain with Boston College Center for Retirement Research. I think it's now up to 170 of the largest plans. SDCERS is in it. And it has all kinds of financial and actuarial metrics. And if you went to NASRA's website or even to Chiron's website, you could find this page and you could compare any plan to the universe of plans on different metrics. So I'm going to show you where SDCERS compares. This first chart is showing SDCERS as the black diamond, and it's saying, in what percentile are you? The top of the light blue and the bottom of the light green is like the 90th percentile. 90% of the plans are in that band. And the middle between the, well, just below the dark blue is the 50th percentile, and you can see on the discount rate, you're at the bottom of the list. There probably are a few plans below that that are in the 90th to 100th percentile. But, SDCERS looks very favorable compared to other plans. Net cash flow is an issue that has caused plans to become vulnerable to investment volatility. Net cash flow is defined as the money's going in versus the money's going out, not counting investments, and what is that as a percent of assets. You're at minus 2% of assets, which is in a positive quartile there in the 50th to 75th. It's once you start going down to 5 or 6% or lower, plans are very, very vulnerable to investment returns. So SDCERS, again, looks good on this measurement.
And just to clarify, this is the city's net cash flow.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the funded ratio. And this is normalizing everyone to the 6.5%. And again, you're in the upper quartile, 50th to 75th as a funded ratio, so you stack up well on all three charts compared to the public plan database. And then we'll turn to the model, but before we do, we prepare this projection at the completion of each valuation, and as I mentioned earlier, we had a meeting with staff earlier. What we're going to do going forward is as soon as we receive payroll data and census data from the system in July or maybe August, we will look to update this if we know in advance payroll has grown higher or lower than expected. But this is the baseline projection, and Alice, if you can go to the live model.
Okay.
So I'm just going to do a couple of scenarios. And by the way, on the bottom chart, I'll just show you what that UAL contribution floor does. Right now, in the top middle, it says UAL payment floor, the $275 million. Change that to 0. You'll see at the bottom what the city's contribution would have been without that. So you would have been experiencing a series of drops, and then we're comparing the gold bars to that red line, and you could see what the board decided, I think it was last summer, right? To maintain the UAL floor until the UAL's paid off, and you can put that back in, Al. Mm-hmm. And the UAL's paid off sooner, but what I'm going to show is what happens if, I understand from Lisa, so far year to date, you're at 6.8%, right? Mm-hmm. So if you were to earn that in a no, not 6.8, 13 for the whole year.
13 for the whole year.
Yeah. So I'm focusing on the ADC. I'm having trouble seeing
Okay,
that.
so let's, I'm going to
The ADC column.
back.
Wait, Carol, do you have a question?
Oh, I just wanted to understand what return we're at through what period. That wasn't clear.
It's the preliminary estimated return through 12/31 of 19 is 6.8.
Okay, so that's 6 months of the.
Right,
Yeah, okay,
correct.
thanks.
And I'm just trying to show the sensitivity of if that bull market continued, the three, are these lights new, by the way?
Aren't they
Do
great?
you like my sunglasses?
What's that?
I brought sunglasses. Use them. They have bifocals, too.
The 365 drops to what?
So the 365 for fiscal year 2022 would drop to 352.6.
So that's a $13 million drop. And now if we had a 0 for the year,
Oh, I see.
the 365 would go to what?
To 377.
So it's like 12 to 13 million swing in either direction if you have that kind of return. And we can also play with different historical periods. I know when we've had board retreats, we do quite a bit of that, but this is online still, right?
We have to update the model that's online and add some of the new board members to that option. So I'll make sure we update it.
So you may want to show the port and the airport projections.
All right, so let's put this back. So the Unified Port District, this is what their projection looks like in terms of their ADC. They also have the UAL payment floor, so a quicker payoff to that unfunded liability. And then you see the contribution in the bottom graph just drops down to the normal cost payment. And since they're an open plan, that normal cost is expected to increase as more participants enter the plan. Let's see. Let's do real quick just to see the same impact that Jean showed for the city. What would a 13% return versus 0% for the fiscal year end look like? So we're comparing this to the fiscal year 2022, this 19.8 million. So at 13%, it goes to 19.2, so a small decrease, and 0 takes it to 20.5. For the airport authority, their ADC really is largely driven by the normal cost. And so once the UAL payment itself is fairly small in terms of their overall ADC payment. So we see a pattern of increases in that employer contribution over this period shown. And if we again look at the fiscal year 2022, the 6.1 million, if the fiscal year in 2020 would return 13, that would drop down to 5.9 million. And if it was a 0% return, it would uptick to 6.3 million.
I can't say it, but did the funding ratio drop below 90?
No, it's still hovering right around 90.
So it wouldn't affect their policy.
All right.
That concludes our presentation.
Okay, anybody have a question? Comment? Go ahead.
Can you, pardon me, can you explain a little bit about your experience study that you're planning on doing?
Yes, we will be commencing that right after this meeting. We collect data on people's termination of employment experience, retirement, disability, mortality, and compare it to expected, and we'll come back. When are we scheduled to come back in July?
In the July meeting.
To compare the actual versus the expected, and usually what happens with experience studies, you tweak some of the assumptions. By tweaking them, I mean, maybe people are turning over a little bit less than before, and I think you mentioned earlier that the liability experience, with the exception of salaries, there aren't too many things that really drive the costs, but we'll be fine-tuning those assumptions. I don't think we'll be doing much with the economic. We've already dropped it down to 6.5. And so again, I think the experience is more of just a double check on these assumptions, and with the city in particular, we'll hone in deeper on what's going on with salary increases.
You mentioned in your presentation that you thought you may know, or you have a suspicion of why that percentage is off a little bit, the liability.
The
Can you
salary
share-
increases?
For the city.
It's,
We think, but we're going to look at a person-by-person analysis by the end of this month and take a look at where is the source of the specific source of the salary loss. We don't know that as we sit here, but by the end of the month, we should see that.
Yeah, in the valuation, there is an assumption on the salaries for inflation and merit, but it's really, we'll focus on that merit component and see if there are some elements that do need updating based on the experience that the city has been seeing year over year.
In prior years, just amplify the average salary you saw in the earlier chart went up by 10.2%. Last year was 8.7, but in all prior years, there's more in the 3, 2, or 1% range. So it's really started kicking in the last couple of years.
Well, those were the years of salary freezes.
Right, right.
Yes.
Okay, Karina's in the queue.
Yes, it's a small amount, but the administrative expense that begins in 2016 and carries through for all of the plans, it's a little lavender pink component. Can you provide some context around there?
Go ahead.
Is it like increase?
Sure.
in-
So when we set during the last experience study, which covered the period 2010 to 2015, so we performed it in 2016, the administrative expense assumption was set based on a 3-year actual average and then increased at 2.5% per year. And the plan has been experiencing the actual experience gains on the expense portion. Now, it's in that other line, but it's relatively small, but there still have been gains on that expense assumption. So that's, again, something we'll look at during the experience study.
Thank you.
Jeffrey?
For the smoothing component that we have to protect from any big differences in the liabilities, does it protect against significant payroll changes? Like if,
No.
no, it's just
the asset.
economics, yeah, okay.
You don't have to.
Is that something we need to implement? Because if I understand the presentation correctly.
Well, that's what the amortization period does. So you have a salary gain or loss, you don't recognize it all at once, you amortize it over the 15 years. So
Oh, that's right.
That's a source of smoothing.
Right. Thank you.
Anybody else? Amos?
Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the work you're going to continue to do to refine kind of the details of what happened and why it's gone up for the city.
Right.
But what I'm hearing preliminarily is that the annual contribution for the city went up. It's a bit of a double-edged sword because, as I understand it, the number's higher than you guys expected because of promotions and other recruitment and retention efforts that you didn't build in time for the analysis. Obviously, the city deemed it critical to provide high-quality services, so that's a double-edged sword where we're trying to recruit and retain people, but also that has an impact ultimately on the pension cost. In terms of the unfunded liability for the city and the funded ratio, I think even though these numbers are always sobering, today's presentation, I think it was slide 29, confirms that this board is likely the most responsible and realistic large board in the state, if not the country. And I'm going to continue to say that because we've made all those changes in the last few years. And I think sometimes it can be misunderstood or the context is missing or the public may not fully understand that our funded ratio and our unfunded liability would look a heck of a lot better if we decided to kind of close our eyes and be blind to the truth. So what I would like to ask is what would our funded ratio be and our unfunded liability be if we hadn't made all those changes? And if you don't have that information today, I'd appreciate that in March.
I'm guessing if you were still at 8%, you'd be at.
Where's the UAL changes?
Yeah, you wouldn't have had the top two, far right, your unfunded liability would have dropped by 1.4 billion.
So roughly in half.
Yeah.
I mean, close to half the unfunded liability could just be washed away if we decided to be like a bunch of other pension boards out there. So I think that's important for everybody to understand. And regardless, it looks to me like the city is 15 years away or so from paying off the unfunded liability. If you don't have that information today, again, for March, I'm wondering if you know if any similarly situated large pension plans can say the same.
Say the same.
That they're 15 years away from paying off the. I mean, we're not the only ones with an unfunded actuarial liability, at least not in terms of large plans. That includes things like plans like CalPERS.
Well, you could go to that database tool, and you could look at CalPERS compared to everybody else, and you could see.
What would I see?
Go to the database, the public plan database charts.
Or you can bring it back in March. It's fine. We don't need to rush through this.
That's SDCERS funded ratio, and you can pick other plans besides SDCERS from that database. And if you want to look at CalPERS, where their black dot is,
Yeah.
right now, 90% of the plans, none of them are at 100%, but I would think those in the light blue, there's a few plans there, would probably meet that goal. But
Sure.
I think you're correct, though, that this is one of the best funded plans. But what's even more important is that not only are you one of the best funded plans in the state, where you came from in 2004.
And that was going to be my last comment is, I think we're still recovering from the stock market losses in 2009, but it bears repeating that when the investment losses of 2009 happened, we were already in a hole dug by our predecessors, unfortunately, and irresponsible city leadership in the early 2000s. So it takes some time to dig out of a hole, and I think this board should be proud of the actions we've taken in recent years to more realistically, systematically, and aggressively attack the unfunded liability. So thanks for the presentation.
Thank you, Amos. George?
Yeah, I agree totally with those conflicts. A short way to say it is that the unfunded liability is self-inflicted.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people maybe get that because just looking at the number by itself, they say, oh my gosh, I've been to conferences and they say, oh my gosh, you have that level of unfunded liability. And I've told them, yeah, but it's self-inflicted, it's discipline. Mm-hmm. And thank you for the idea there.
Nasi?
I think the comment that I want to make is that I don't know that we're I don't know that we're 100% of where we need to be, but we're in a good spot. But I think most importantly, what I think we're really doing, and sort of the statement that I think the public needs to understand is we're making sure that the plan sponsors keep their promises to the retirees. And that's the biggest difference, is that what's happened in the last few years is we're moving the plan sponsors in a position where they are substantially less likely or actuarially less likely to fail, and therefore we're guaranteeing that that these retirees are actually going to get what they receive, and that's different than what happens in the public sector where those funded ratios aren't there, or other public plans where the money isn't there. And I think that's the important issue. It's one thing to make a promise; it's another thing to keep a promise. If you got little kids at home like I do, huge difference. So, anyway.
Thank you. Any further comments? Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation. I guess we'll see you again in March.
Yes.
And then we'll vote.
Right.
Okay. We're moving now to the fiscal year 2019 CAFR, and that's Marcel. And while you start talking, I'm going to grab a water out of the bathroom.
Thank you. I had to go grab a prop and say thank you to Thanasi, because the theme of our CAFR this year, keeping our promises so you can keep yours. So thank you for that perfect segue into our discussion on the CAFR. So in your materials today is the final CAFR. It was a labor of love again this year, and I want to talk about some changes that were made and thank a lot of people that helped out on it. I especially want to thank Sarah Dixon and the Audit Committee, because they did some changes to their process this year. We worked with Ted to get the changes in how they were receiving the information. So one thing that was very different this year, besides that they got it earlier than they've gotten it in the past, was that the CAFR that was presented to the Audit Committee had all of staff's comments, all of MGO's comments in it. So it basically was the final CAFR, absent there being something significant that happened at that meeting. So that was really nice that we had that. So again, thank you to the Audit Committee, and thank you to Sarah Dixon for coordinating this change in the schedule for this year. One of the things that Ted did to help get this CAFR out earlier was he involved quite a bit more staff. So I wanted to thank Jamie Hamrick for her continued support of the cash footnote, and especially for her training of Liz Mudgett, who took it over this year. So that was a big change. Monty Pareto took over the actuarial section this year. And then we had Rich Delgado, who took on the statistical section. So with more support from staff, that enabled us to get that out earlier. I know Ted has plans next year to continue to streamline the process and continue to get more staff involved. So I'm looking forward to a better and quicker process again next year. We have applied for the GFOA award, and our communications director has submitted the application for the PAFR award. So we're looking forward to receiving those again, hopefully this year. And with that, I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Questions? Well, thanks for that report. Clearly, this was a really great cooperative effort throughout the organization. A lot of people contributed to this excellent outcome, and we thank all staff involved. It's great.
I'm sorry, Carol, one more thing. One other important piece that I didn't mention. Excuse me. There were no management comments from MGO this year, and that's very unheard of. But they did not have any comments of you need to fix this, do this better next year. So that was also a really big deal this year.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, we're now moving to the Audit Committee report with Bobby Spoon.
So the audit committee, the last audit committee meeting was held at the end of November, November 20th. And the purpose of that meeting was to review the CAFR. So I, again, would like to thank Ted and his department and all of the people that participated in that grand effort. By the time the CAFR came to the audit committee, it was substantially done, which was the first time that that's happened, and it took a heroic effort for that to occur. So, you know, as an auditor, I grew up as an auditor, it's very hard to delegate, Ted, I know, and I know that as many people as you delegated to, you redid all of their work, I am sure. So thank you. It gets easier. The more you do it, the easier it will become. So thank you. And also I know, Ted, if there were errors, of which there were none, there were no adjusting errors. There were no errors. There were no journal entries that were made, and there were no comments that were required by the auditors. If there had been, you would have heard about it. So you are where the buck stops with that. So thank you very much for your work. We heard the presentation from Ted on the CAFR. We heard from MGO. They presented their communications. And then we heard a report from Sarah. Sarah just discussed updates to the Internal Audit Policies and Procedure Manual in preparation for then the upcoming external peer review, which I understand is now completed. And they also have had no comments. So that's also wonderful, wonderful news. And we heard from Greg, who at that point had a potential audit committee candidate addition, Lena Ranchenko. And we have, I don't know if it's too early.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Greg met with her. Sarah actually came up with the idea of contacting Lana. Lana comes from Sempra. She's a Sempra retiree and known to both Karina and Sarah. Greg met with her. Staff has reviewed her background. Paul and I had lunch with her, and she is absolutely a perfect candidate, just a perfect candidate. We're very fortunate that she's interested in joining our group, and she is very, very interested. And she's reached out to Sarah and to the audit committee members already. After that, we had, Sarah discussed, well, we had reports. One, a verbal report from Sarah, and then written reports from IT, legal, State Street, and annual private market reporting. And that was it. Our next meeting is in March. That's it.
Great, thank you. And next is Disability Committee, Charlie Hodquist.
Good morning. Yesterday, excuse me, yesterday's meeting we had several items that we went on concerning a retirement applications, and let's see, hang on, I just hit the wrong button here, so I screwed everything up. We got it. If you look at our consent item, there is one item, number 3, where the recommendation to deny the industrial disability application of Vincent Wynn, that has been pulled. The member has requested us to delay hearing on it because he wanted more information or more time to prepare, and in my position as chair of the committee, I was allowed to grant that position, and the rest of the committee supported that. Concerning the other items, staff has recommended, and we supported that with a unanimous vote, to approve the industrial disability application of Anthony Criso. We also voted unanimously to
recommend the approval of the industrial disability application of Justin Myers. We also had a unanimous vote to grant or recommend the granting of an industrial disability application to Daniel Samilo, and also to recommend the retirement application of Sharon Stokes McPherson. We did have one application where the adjudicator recommended a denial of the application. We did discuss that matter, and we did support that recommendation, and all of those votes were made with the unanimous vote of the committee. So with that, I believe we need a motion.
It's for you. No second
Did he make the
required.
motion?
No motion's necessary.
I made it.
Okay, great.
Ready to vote?
Second is necessary. I say.
All votes are in.
Oh, George, did you vote?
Here he is.
He voted.
Oh, now it came in. Okay. The motion passes 13-0.
Okay, thank you. And next, B&G.
All right. Well, okay, so I'm gonna pull item number 1 from the consent agenda to talk about later. Is there any board member who wishes to pull any other items from the consent agenda? Okay, so all of the items 2 through 11 passed unanimously in the B&G committee meeting. I know all of you guys have read the material, but is there anybody, was there anybody who had any questions or comments on any of them? Okay, great. So then can we get, I'll move to have those approved. Yeah, I'm pulling one.
Oh, I didn't save it.
I don't know where I'm supposed to be.
Current item.
Okay.
We're supposed to be, we don't have the buttons yet.
Okay.
Good.
Ah,
Yeah,
well, do you want to pull that?
it's fine. Paul
Okay.
can.
It's okay.
Okay.
Ready to vote?
All right, and that motion passes 13-0. All right, let's go back to item number 1. This regards the ad hoc committee's recommendation for fiduciary counsel. I'll give you some background on that. So fiduciary counsel serves at the pleasure of the board, but we routinely and historically have gone back every 5 years for an RFP to evaluate candidates. A couple of preliminary comments I'll make. Number 1, I was really pleased, and it was in your material, so I'm sure when you read it, you must also be ecstatic about the fact that we had really excellent quality candidates applying, and not just from California, from all over the United States. So I was extremely pleased. I think that speaks volume about staff and about our system and about our current processes and procedures and what we're doing here, because nobody wants to be part of a sinking ship, and we clearly are not. And I think it speaks volumes to what's going on here. So I would say thank you to all of you for that. Secondly, the process by which we went through is we established an ad hoc committee, and I want to recognize Bobby and Cliff, who were part of that ad hoc committee with me. They're the ones that did the heavy lifting, and without any disparagement to Cliff, I got to say that the real heavy lifting was done by Bobby, which I will also say as an aside, if you have to run a committee and you need somebody on your committee, I would pick Bobby. I will tell you, I would just do that. I don't care what you need to have done, just do that, because she'll make you look good, I'll tell you. But she did the initial analysis and comparisons. She did the initial kind of information, and it was extremely helpful to me. She did the initial round of interviews and phone calls, and then the rest of us went through and did that. It was a huge, laborious process. It took a lot of hours. And what I will say, what I was really proud of about the ad hoc committee is they really dug in and took this really, really seriously and went through and kind of really scrubbed these applications. I would also like to say that I want to, Chris Waddell is our current fiduciary counsel. I want to thank Chris. He is not the recommended choice, but that's not due to any failure on his part. I think he's represented us very, very well. I think he's done a great job. I think the system would do well to have Chris continue. Having said that, after doing a full analysis, I think that we had a uniquely strong group of candidates, and I think that challenged us to really think about what we wanted for the future. Remember, Fiduciary Council is the board's attorney. They represent the system and the board, but they're the board's attorney, and so and they're the ones that need to advise us on some of these issues. And I think what we're looking for is how do we make sure we get this plan to the next place. We've got a lot of challenges still ahead of us. We're doing well, but we're looking for the person to lead us. And so the ad hoc committee made a recommendation to the B&G committee to hire Reed Smith. The B&G committee voted unanimously to hire Reed Smith. And I would like to ask Harvey to come up. Harvey is with Reed Smith, and he is the recommended choice. What I will say is that the ad hoc committee, for a number of reasons, selected only one candidate. We didn't need to bring in multiple candidates. Reed Smith was far and away, I think, the top choice. And I know Bobby got into that. I'm going to let her make some comments on that. I don't need to steal her thunder. But I will say I think the most impressive issues about Harvey is, number one, he's a hell of a dresser. He wears a phenomenal scent that's sophisticated yet understated. And he wears glasses, which gives him at least a couple of IQ points above and beyond the lawyers who do not wear glasses. And so I think that alone, I think, just sort of kind of puts icing on the cake. But there were some other factors that Bobby will go through. So I've asked Harvey to be here, and I would also just like to thank him because Harvey agreed to come down. We haven't voted for him yet, and so that vote will take place. But he agreed to come down, and I wanted him to be here so that you guys could, number one, meet him, and that if anybody had any questions or wanted to talk to him, that they could do that. He was kind enough to engage us yesterday at the B&G committee meeting, gave us a number of comments, and I really appreciated that. So, Harvey, thank you. And Bobby, why don't I turn it over to you to give your comments on kind of how we got here.
Thank you for that unexpected turnover.
Glad it was to you, not me.
Oh, it's going to be you. Rather than have me explain, may I just ask you a couple of questions, and I asked you yesterday. One of the things that was very impressive to me is that you told me that your firm and you only represent boards. You don't represent plan sponsors, and you don't represent labor. And that was unique among all of the firms that I chatted with. Would you explain that?
Certainly. Thank you, and good morning to the entire board. I'm honored to be here, and I want to honor Member Spoon because she had to literally interview 6 attorneys. Can you imagine what that's like? It's tough, but thank you. Listen, I've been in the business of advising pension boards for a couple of decades now, and it became very clear to me initially, and continues to be clear to me, that I first have to define my responsibility to you before I can come to you and say, what are your fiduciary responsibilities to the members of the system? In looking at my responsibilities, the things that are key, absolutely key, non-negotiable to me, are the issues of integrity and independence. And the way that I assure complete independence to be able to advise boards on fiduciary aspects of the responsibilities that you undertake is to assure you that I am neither favoring one side of the equation or the other. You all are either appointed or elected by the members, appointed by the mayor, who is the highest officer of your plan sponsor. I'll leave the port and airport aside for a moment, just talk about the city. So many of you come to the board as having been placed here by the plan sponsor. Others of you come here because you're honored to be elected by the membership that we serve, and you come in that way. But once you're here, your obligation is first and foremost to the members of the system and to make this system work. And I want to come back to that, if I may, because I heard some incredibly terrific. I want to give you a little feedback on what I heard a little bit during the actuarial conversation this morning. The way I assure my complete independence is that my firm, and this is a global law firm, we have 3,000 employees, 1,800 attorneys worldwide. My firm has agreed with me that we will not represent plan sponsors, that we will not represent labor and employees, but that they will allow me to be completely independent and have the firm represent only public employee pension boards and members of pension boards. That, to me, is talismanic to my ability to assure you that what I say to you is completely independent, not driven politically, not driven by bias, not driven by reverse engineering outcomes. And so that is incredibly important to my ability to deliver services to the board. So that's how that came about, and I'm delighted that my firm supports me in that regard.
Secondly, will you talk to us about your availability? I mean, you have a very strong reputation in the pension community, and you have very large clients, and you have a lot of clients. So can you speak to us about your availability to us?
I'm a Southwest frequent flyer. my office is, so my regular office is in San Francisco. I probably spend about 2 days a week in San Francisco. The rest of the time I am with clients at board meetings, committee meetings, or whatever is required. But San Diego SDCERS would be an extremely important client to me, and I will devote my own personal attention to you, and I have no problem. I fly out of Oakland. It's the easiest airport on the West Coast to fly in and out of. I can actually get here a lot faster than I can get to my client, the city of San Jose pension funds. It actually takes me less time to drive, to get here than it does to get to San Jose during the commute hours by car. So I spend a lot of time in Sacramento. I have other clients across the United States, but this would be an important assignment. I would pledge to you my personal time and attention to the extent that I can be a resource that this board can turn to navigate those difficult fiduciary issues that come up.
You know, in your resume, you refer to yourself as focusing on strategic policy matters. Can you give us an example? And you have an associate, Jeff Rigger.
Yeah, well, I have a whole team of people that work with me, very knowledgeable, and it's a very deep bench. I'm delighted to have the quality of people work with me, and I would turn to them on a regular basis as well. Strategic. There are a couple of really remarkable challenges, I think, that all of our public boards are facing. You'll notice that over a significant period of time, over the last 10 years, whether it's this board or other boards, we haven't really moved the funding needle on an absolute basis.
It just goes up. And
just, yeah. So we seem to be at this 70% level, no matter what happens. The other thing is that the actuaries will talk to you about how a system is a mature system. As I was talking to Thanasi the other day, that's like in the banking business, they used to talk about unborn receivables as counting as assets. We're in a situation that where the ratio of active employees to retirees has been turned upside down. And that puts a lot of pressure on the investment portfolio. Let me try to make that equation for you, if I may. When you are in a negative cash flow situation, as this system is, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a fact of the demographics of the system. But what it means is that every year, instead of being able to reinvest more and more of the cash that comes off of your investment portfolio, you're needing to tap that cash to pay benefits, which means that your ability to stay with an assumed rate of return over 7% or more has an enormous amount of pressure on it. And you're starting to make decisions in your investment portfolio that are driven by the negative cash flow related to the contributions that are coming in. That, how to address that issue is something that I work with many boards on dealing, and it's an investment issue. It cuts across actuarial considerations. It cuts across your assumed rate of return. It cuts across your plan sponsor's tolerance for risk as well. I'm sure on paper, most plan sponsors would love to see 7.5%, 8% returns year in and year out. To get those kind of returns, you have to take more risk, but their budgeting process at the plan sponsor level may not encourage you to take on that kind of risk because they can't take on the downside of that risk. So it's a very we're in a phase now starting, it started a few years ago, but certainly in the 2020s, our focus is, from a fiduciary standpoint in funding, is going to be very much on balancing those levels of risk and return, impact on the portfolio, impact on the ability to pay benefits, and what the contribution rates are going to be. It's a high wire act. What I think I can bring to that process is first to learn and understand how the system works and what the pressure points are on the system, and also maybe bring to you some innovative thoughts about how to approach funding in perhaps different ways, and at least get the board starting to think in terms of a macro view of setting policies that will help navigate those pressures over time. That's part of the strategic approach that I would like to take with the board if I am honored to be engaged by you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for coming up
Thank you.
this weekend.
I just want to add just a couple of quick issues. There were two things that stood out for me, and one was the depth of his bench, that, and meaning the terms of people that are available. He's not just a solo working in a large firm. There's people that are on his team. You touched on that, Harvey, and I appreciate that. The other thing that hasn't been discussed that I do want to point out, because I think it's worth pointing out, Harvey actually also litigates in this area, and he's actually had to handle several high-profile cases and whatnot. I understand he's also won a couple of them. I don't know. That's a rumor. But in any event, I think what that does is it gives a lawyer who's trying to advise you some additional perspective or a different perspective, and I think that's something that we haven't had as a skill set of some of the prior attorneys that have been here as fiduciary counsel. It doesn't mean that they haven't done their job or anything of that nature. I want to be very clear, but it gives him a different perspective. And at the end of the day, as fiduciary counsel, what we really want Harvey to do is to keep us focused in the right direction and keep us out of trouble. We don't want to spend the $1 million fees in litigation if we can possibly help it, and by getting good advice up front, that's important. And the last item that I'll cover, and I appreciate Harvey for helping with this, is that one of the frustrations I've had since I've been on the board is that we tend to rely on the CEO and Johnny for when fiduciary counsel needs to be involved or to highlight issues. And it's not fair to them, because that's not their job. And one of the things that's been frustrating to me is that I don't know that we've been focusing on that. And in talking with Harvey, one of his suggestions that he's implemented in other places is that they like to review the materials that the board gets ahead of time and communicate with the board members about issues that they've identified that involve a fiduciary issue, which then allows us, when we're reading this voluminous amount of material, to focus in on certain things that our lawyer is saying, hey, this is something that really is going to be an issue, and you should do that. So it's that proactive approach that, for me, made a huge difference. And I think it also allows Johnny and Greg to not have to do a job it's not their job, right? Fiduciary counsel should be doing that. Obviously, they need to work together, but two different roles. So, Bobby, thank you. Cliff, thank you. So with that, if there are no questions, well, first of all, does anybody have any questions for Harvey or any of the committee members for that matter? Okay. With that, I would like to move the appointment of Reed Smith as fiduciary counsel.
Did you move?
I did.
Okay.
Ready to vote? Yeah, what?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Joe.
Joe.
Can you do that?
Yes, absolutely. As the chair of this committee, go for it.
I can't see.
By the way, anybody who compliments my dad, I don't care what he wants to say. Go ahead. It's all yours. And by the way, I should also mention, between you and I, Dad has 2 fans. Mom is not sure yet. Her vote is out. But between you and I, he's got 2. So thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for I would have put in a request to speak had I known that Harvey was going to be selected. I wanted to just reaffirm your selection because Harvey was also our selection for fiduciary counsel when we first come out of the big thicket. And he provided stellar information all along. In fact, I had commented at one time after some of his background presentations that I thought that we should be in line for some continuing credit for law school after his presentations. He was able to clarify things so well. I thought he'd make an excellent professor. And not only that, but I tend to hang on to those good sources. So since that time, it's been some years since I've been on the board, I've maintained contact with Harvey because I still have questions. And he has still answered those questions fully, freely, pro bono. So I just wanted to support that selection. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very much.
I want you to know that I did not bring Joe here today. I had no idea. It's wonderful to see Joe.
All right. Well, the tally of that vote is 13-0, so that's official, which now means that as of now, you are fiduciary counsel, and so thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm quite honored, and if I may make one comment, because I referenced the conversation of the actuarial. I heard some things from board members this morning that were incredibly encouraging, and the comments that Member Udras made about funding and the tough decisions that this board has made. And it struck me, based on the other comments that I heard, that you are light years ahead of many boards in terms of just understanding, the actuaries talk about the valves and stuff like that. Those valves are the things that boards get to turn, and you only have a few of them. And it's clear to me that my relationship with you is starting at a very high level. So for that, I am deeply appreciative and very impressed. So thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Harvey. We look forward to working with you.
Thank you. All right, so moving to the information items, there was only one. Johnny there was a discussion about the employment practices liability insurance. You might remember that issue came up, I think, at the last board meeting, and there was a question about how much insurance do we have, how much insurance is appropriate. Johnny and Greg came back, and they stingily recommended $1 million policy. Thank God that Paul was here, because he was able to school the two of them on and help them with their misguided recommendation. Actually, I'm joking, but I do mean it sincerely, especially for those people who have never faced one of these claims or have never been sued. It's sometimes hard to understand how these things materialize. And actually outside the board meeting, Paul had reminded me that it's not just threats from internally, meaning employees or staff. It could be potential issues from vendors or third parties, or members. And so I think the issue was the B&G committee, despite the fact that we were not asked for a recommendation, thanks to Paul's courage, we made the recommendation that they increase the coverage to $3 million. And instead of having getting into any kind of a Donnybrook with Bobby, they just conceded to it. And so it's not even an action item. But I wanted to explain that the B&G committee, when we have to pin management down, we do it, okay? So thank you. Any questions on that issue? All right, hearing none, let's get to the reports. Let me try and summarize those. So Cynthia Queen, she said that Member Services continues to adapt services to meet members' needs, and pre-retirement seminars are currently in high demand. She didn't say what the entrance fee was, so I'm assuming we're dropping price to keep demand high. She said the Employee of the Year and STAR team member Andrea Valdez earned a promotion to another retirement agency, which is a nice way of saying that we let another good one slip through our hands. It's a good thing that your evaluation is already in the books because, my friend, it would be different today. I'm just saying. All right. Okay. Benefits Administration. Marcel gave a report. She claimed that there was an error, that an error was discovered where some airport employees were granted full-time service credits for periods where they made part-time employee contributions. All accounts have been updated, and the 88 impacted members have been informed, which means that SDCERS once again ruined Christmas for 88 people. Okay, with regard to items number 3 through 7, there was no comment or discussion because, as the board knows, the B&G committee reads their material in advance, and it was so well done by staff that there was no reason to ask any questions. I will say that Greg makes me let staff talk at my meetings because he likes to have long meetings. And I want you to know, for the first time, he did not have Ted on the list, and I was not going to let that go. So I gave Ted 5 minutes of fame, to which he just said nothing. That was it. So I try to do you solid, and I'm just saying, you let me down a little bit. I'm just saying, okay? With that, unless there are questions or comments, I think that covers the disability, or the B&G committee, the B&G committee meeting.
Yeah, that's quite enough.
Thank you.
But I do want to circle back and thank the 3 members of the ad hoc committee who assisted or conducted the search for fiduciary counsel, especially Bobby, apparently, who outdid herself once again. So thank you very much. Okay. Next, we have investment committee, and that is Karina Coleman.
Yes, so yesterday the committee met and we had 4 informational items. We had a presentation from GSM Grosvenor on our credit strategy, and Demetrius is going to come up and walk us through that. I will just note that the PM that presented, Craig Goldsmith, he informed us an interesting statistic that was 60% of the high yield market is yielding less than 5%. So it's becoming ever more challenging for institutional investors to seek their required rate of return. And it's really important to have a manager that can toggle across the various opportunities that the markets present and have that flexibility and nimbleness for us. So with that forward, Demetrius, you want to take us through that first item?
Sure. I'm just going to give a brief review of what was talked about yesterday. GCM Grosvenor was hired in 2014 to manage a credit strategy for SDCERS' Opportunity Fund. The goal of this strategy when it was incepted was to create a concentrated portfolio of about 10 to 20 underlying funds that were invested in strategies such as corporate credit, which is investing in the debt of companies. Structured credit, for example, portfolios of credit cards or auto loans that are bundled together. And loan portfolios, for example, buying loans of banks that are forced to delever. These strategies aim at delivering attractive risk-adjusted returns and having low correlations to the traditional asset classes that SDCERS is invested in. Since inception, the strategy has an annualized return of 5.5% and an annualized standard deviation of just about 3%, and has outperformed both its benchmark and the larger Opportunity Fund benchmark. Are there any questions?
No? Okay, so moving on, did you want to, while you're still up here at the podium, talk about the survey on the fees?
Yes. Each year, SDCERS participates in the CEM Defined Benefit Investment Benchmarking Survey. This survey compares asset allocation, return, and fee data for a large group of participating plans. And this year, staff was tasked with using this survey data to compare how SDCERS stacks up to its peers from a fee or cost perspective. The results look pretty good. In 2018, SDCERS' total investment cost, which adds up investment management fees, custodial and consulting fees, and administrative expenses, was about $46 million, or 57 basis points. This is significantly lower than the benchmark that was calculated by CEM of $56 million or 69 basis points. And there are two main factors that are contributing to this. The first is that SDCERS has a higher percentage of its assets in passively managed strategies, which have lower fees. And the second is that SDCERS pays less than the average plan when it comes to custodial and consulting fees and administrative costs. So overall, the takeaway from this survey is that SDCERS's investments are being managed in a cost-effective manner compared to its peers.
Great. We're going to come to performance in a minute. I know there are also some internal reports that were in the written materials. I just wanted to call out the relationship with parametric and the equitization of cash in a year when equity markets really rallied. And maybe you can comment on that as well.
Sure. As you mentioned, 2019 was a pretty good year for stocks, and SDCERS would have been at a performance disadvantage if we had cash that was sitting in the portfolio uninvested for periods of time. So because we had this cash in the cash overlay program that's managed by Parametric, SDCERS gained over $18 million the past year. So since inception, this has performed exactly how we expect it to, and we continue to expect it to add value to the fund.
Beautiful. That's not chump change. Okay, I think we would like to have now performance. Anders Norman, if you'd come forward. The quarter performance was maybe, as Aon said, a little bit underwhelming. I think it's important to look at the longer term returns, especially impressive with the 20-year return first percentile. But maybe you can take us through something a little bit more relevant, a more recent performance here, Anders.
Sure. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Happy New Year's to you. I have the pleasure covering total fund performance for the quarter ending September 30th today. So I thought I would cover first performance relative to our benchmark, and then talk a little bit about performance relative to our peers on a risk-adjusted basis, and also add some high-level comments on the asset classes. And with that said, I'm going to move right into the presentation. Thanks. Yeah, there you go. So as you can see on this page, the quarterly performance was 0.9% net of fees, in line with the benchmark. And over the last 3, 5, 10 years, and since inception, we've been able to beat the actuarial rate of return of 6.5%, which is important. So this page shows the risk-adjusted returns compared to our peers. So as you can see on the left side, it says Sharpe ratio, which is basically a measure of the unit of return for the unit, for every unit of risk. So it's risk related to return, basically. So as you can see, 3 years, we're in the top 5% of pension plans, and over 5 years, we're in the top 7%. Over 10 years, we're in the 21st percentile. That jump has to do with our risk that was a little bit higher over the last 10 years. It's come down over the last 5 and 3 years due to results, that's a result of thoughtfully implemented decisions by the board, consultant, and staff. And with that, I'm going to move on to attribution. So before I move on to attribution, just a little high-level comment on asset classes. The 0.9% return for the quarter may not be as impressive as stock market performance for 2019 has been. But as you can see here, asset class performance has been fairly muted over the quarter. So that's what drove the 0.9% return. On this page, the allocation effect drove performance in the third quarter, while selection effects detracted from performance, effectively netting it out to a 0% compared to the benchmark. Looking at the allocation effect, you can see that private equity drove the allocation effect. And this was basically because the private equity asset class did better than the total fund policy benchmark, which results in a positive allocation effect. And looking at the selection effect, which basically is manager value add compared to our benchmark, you can see that private equity was the big detractor there because private equity didn't do as well as its benchmark. Looking at the last two slides, I would also caution that private markets should be looked upon on an internal rate of return basis, not a time-weighted rate of return, which we measure public markets on. And since we're looking at the total fund, unfortunately, we have to look at the whole portfolio on a time-weighted rate of return. So it's a little bit like comparing apples and oranges when looking at that. And with that, that concludes my remarks. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Okay. Don't see any questions. I think the next thing we're going to have is Jamie Hamrick is going to come and talk about a reporting enhancement for our private equity portfolios.
Good morning. Basically wanted to give you a preview of upcoming material. So in response to some feedback that staff received about trying to streamline private equity performance presentations, staff will begin to present combined and side-by-side analysis on the private equity and infrastructure portfolios. This information will accompany the quarterly performance reports from GCM Grosvenor and Stepstone, who are our advisors for those allocations. Staff believes that this analysis will provide a more complete picture of the allocation and provide a way to compare and contrast each portfolio. Staff also believes that this additional report will provide the board with another tool to use in monitoring these allocations. Just wanted to give you a preview on it.
Great work. Well, we appreciate the improvement in the performance reporting, and putting those two portfolios together keeps us focused on the bigger picture. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Other than that, the other only informational item we had was the changes to the charter for non-board investment committee members. I don't have anything really else to say on that, just that if you get a new member, they will start a new term if a prior member has stepped down before his or her term has expired. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Carol.
Okay, thanks, Karina. Okay, we are coming to the end of our agenda. So now it is time for questions and comments from the trustees and staff. And I believe Charlie has comments.
Yes, thank you very
Not on. Apologies.
Okay. Thank you. As we get ready to adjourn the board meeting today, I would like to for us to do it in memory of Dave Hall. He served this board as a trustee, but just to tell you a little bit about him, he joined the San Diego Police Department in November 23rd, 1962, and he retired in January 5th of 1993. And if you've read his obituary, had people talk to you about it, they'll tell you about his 32 years of service in the police department, retiring as a captain, going on to be the police chief of the Harbor Police, working overseas with security agencies to help set up national police departments and other things. He did lots of great stuff, but his real focus was always on the people he worked with in the police department and here in the retirees. Not only did he serve here in the board, he served several times as president of the Retired Fire and Police Association, and he also had a very high ethical standard. I met Dave Hall in July 1978. I was a recruit in the police academy. He was a sergeant, and since there were two Sergeant Halls on the police department, because he was Tall Hall. Yeah. And for the next 6 months, I went to classes with him where he taught us about ethics, about doing the right thing, even though it hurt. And during the course of my career in the police department, our paths crossed many times. After he left the police department, we still kind of ran into each other because when I left the city to go work for the college, he was our post advisor from the state and would come to meetings. So we always stayed together. As I was stepping down, I started becoming a member of the board of the Retired Fire and Police Association, and I was actually in line to become the next president. But Dave tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Charlie, I need you to do me a favor. We need somebody to represent the retirees on the SDCERS board. Would you do that?" And with his encouragement, I am here. So you are stuck with me. If you want to blame anybody, you can blame Dave. Okay? But he made a lot of contributions to everybody, and he always went out of his way to make your day better. And no matter how sick he got, he never
complained about it, but he always asked you how you were doing, what was wrong, how things could go. So he always had that forward-looking attitude. And with that, I just wanted to close the meeting in his memory, and there is going to be a service for him on Sunday at 1 o'clock. But we will do that. And thank you very much for the time.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those lovely comments. Clearly, Dave Hall was a wonderful person who did a lot for the city and this organization, and we appreciate everybody's comments about him today. And when we do adjourn the meeting at the very end, we'll be doing that in his honor. A comment?
Yes, not implying anything, but every time, every time I hear of staff leaving, one of the things I always ask myself is, what is our retention policy? What are we doing to ensure that we keep it? Because we have a number of groups that like to poach from us. When you're doing well, when your name is in lights, people can find you pretty easily. And we have some talented staff here that I know is important to me as a board member to make sure that we retain. So one of the things I would ask staff to do, or ask you to do, is perhaps at the next meeting, give us some understanding of what we're doing, how we're going about it, how we're ensuring that the good people stay. I mean, the not good people can leave. That's fine. But I'm just saying the good people, I want to know how those people are going to be, what we're doing to kind of retain them. So,
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, that's really consistent with some of the things we've been talking with Greg about and through the process of this 2019 review that we're going to discuss later, but that's a great comment. Okay, so now I believe Greg has some comments before we go to closed session.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to highlight that we have a new video on SDCERS.com. It's How Drop Works, and it's meant for our members to learn about how the deferred retirement plan option works. And this is our third video available to our members. We also have a video, SDCERS 101, to learn about how your SDCERS pension works. SDCERS annual member statements to learn about how SDCERS annual member statements work. And we have also additional videos being planned. And so I wanted to thank Jessica Maloney. She's our communications manager. Hi, Jessica. For being our script writer and director. I wanted to give a special thank you to Cynthia Queen, our member services director, for being our narrator and producer on the video. And a special shout out to Jerry Koptic, our retirement counselor, for lending his image on one of the counseling slides. I also wanted to highlight that SDCERS also provides in-house operational training for staff. One of the things we do to help recruitment and retention, to recognize the following presenters on felony forfeitures, Johnny Tran, death benefits, Sandra Clausen, membership tiers, Monty Pareto, and we did have a session on SDCERS core values this time, focusing on our core value of integrity. We had Rebecca Shee and Richard Delgado from our accounting area do a really nice job with explaining what that is and how we bring it to life here at SDCERS. I would like to thank our 2019 Awards and Recognition Committee staff members who help us recognize employees throughout the year who promote LaSera's mission, vision, and core values.
LaSera's?
Did I say that? SDCERS.
Harvey, what are we supposed to do as a board when our CEO doesn't even know who he works for? I'm just curious.
So Dave, can we scrub the video? Is that possible? Wow.
Wow.
So I would like to thank Farnaz Farahani, Lori Hausland, Jessica Maloney, Jane Needham, Anders Norman, Lorda Silva, Sarima Valenzuela, and a special thanks to our IT consultant, Ann O'Rourke, who has many talents, including being our master decorator. I would also like to thank our SDCERS 2019 Health and Wellness Committee. There's our staff members that help us focus on being healthy with our Stepper Challenge, personal exercise program, Eating Healthy and Smoothie Club, and that would be Sarah Dixon, Paul Deshawn, Farnaz Farhani, Lori Hausland, and Lorda Silva. And I would like to remind us that we have our annual board offsite meeting on Wednesday, February 12th, coming right up. This meeting will be held where we had it last year at the Prado at Balboa Park, and it will be a retreat for the discussion primarily of pension governance. Our discussions will begin at 8:30, but please come a little bit early to enjoy some networking and some coffee. And we'll be talking about strategic priorities and objectives, board governance with a focus on being a policy-driven board, and cover governance best practices. We'll have a special session on the global investment outlook with Joaquin Fells from our, who's a global economic advisor for PIMCO. Thank you, Liza, for arranging that. And also a report from our ad hoc committee on the CEO and CCO evaluation process. So additional information will be coming to you regarding that meeting, and that concludes my comments.
Great. I just want to know where the smoothies are. I didn't get one. Anyway. Okay, thanks for your comments. Okay, so we're going to go into closed session now, so we need to clear the room except for the board, executive, and legal staff, and we're going to take a 5 or 10 minute rest stop before that. Yeah. You can?
Sure.
Okay. Hello, hello. Oh, yay, thanks. I love the artwork. Every year the artwork is so good.
Hard copy of the cabinet.
Thank you very much. This is easy to read. I can do it online.
Yes.
I try not to speak when we mention his name because everything that comes out of my mouth is terrible.
Okay.
You can ask him to join the meeting. It's all right. He needs to say his piece.
You?
Charlie. I mean,
Oh, we already did.
You want to do the report out, Johnny?
Sure, there's nothing to report out of closed session.
That's true. So thank you very much. So that concludes the meeting. If, is there any additional business? Then we would like to adjourn this meeting in memory of David Hall. And the meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.